This episode of Hello PhD is sponsored by Promega and listeners like you. Thanks for your support.
If razor blades were laying around the lab and people kept getting cut on them, we wouldn't say, well, we're opening a Band-Aid station.
It's not the science that people don't like, but it's the environment in which they are doing science.
Welcome to Hello PhD, a podcast for scientists and the people who love them. This week, we reveal the results of a global survey of scientists' mental health. Stay with us.
And we're back. This is Hello PhD, episode 165. I'm Joshua Hall.
I'm Daniel Arneman.
And we'll discuss the human side of science and life in the lab. Welcome back, Dan.
Happy spooky season, Josh. It is nearly Halloween. And do you have something planned? Are you dressing up?
My kids are planning to go trick-or-treating in our neighborhood on Sunday evening. My son actually picked out a Halloween costume that is a biohazard suit with a gas mask. So,
yikes!
Culturally appropriate, I guess.
Yeah, that's good. He's going as a CDC hot zone scientist or something.
I think so. But Dan, in the spirit of Halloween, we have a beer that I think fully embraces the season. Dan, this is from Harpoon Brewing, and Harpoon is in Boston, Massachusetts. Do you know what else is big in Boston, Massachusetts, Dan?
I do. My brother lives in Boston, and they say America runs on Dunkin', but really Boston runs on Dunkin'.
That's right. Dunkin' Donuts, now referred to as Dunkin', I believe. This is a collab, I guess you could say, of Harpoon Brewing and Dunkin' Donuts, the collaboration we never thought to ask for. But this is the Harpoon Dunkin' Pumpkin, and I'm assuming this is an official collaboration because this Dunkin' logo looks pretty official. I can't imagine they'd be using it without permission.
Yeah, that would be against several laws if they took that. All right, well, here goes nothing. You know, we always try to do a pumpkin ale or some kind of Oktoberfest around this season. We'll see how gross it is.
I mean, I like pumpkin pie. I like donuts.
You know, we have gone in search of the ultimate pumpkin beer each year. I think we do this, and often are disappointed. But
I haven't found the perfect one yet. I will say I like the Dunkin' pumpkin donut. Have you had it, Dan?
I have not.
Oh, I should have got that for the show. Well, let's taste. Okay, this is going to be.
Okay.
I have opinions here. I will say, as I often prefer to do, I opened my bottle of Dunkin' Pumpkin and poured it into a glass. And the malty, yeasty smell kind of overwhelmed me at first. I was not sure if I was going to like this. I feel like sometimes pumpkin beers almost edge into that sour, but not in a good way, taste. Right. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do.
I like this.
I think it tastes like bubble gum. Keep in mind, mine is warmer because I just went and found it, and it was not in the fridge. But I'm getting a distinct bubble gum and a little bit of an aspartame flavor off of it. So it is not what I expected.
Well, let me tell you what I do like about it. I will agree with you that it is sweeter than I expected.
Yeah.
Which is probably the most negative aspect of it, I would say. But if there's something that I usually ding pumpkin beers for, especially those that... we even had a beer a few years ago that supposedly had several whole pumpkin pies thrown into the mash, right? And you couldn't taste any pumpkin pie at all in the beer. I feel like I'm definitely getting those cinnamony, vanilla-y, spicy notes in this beer.
Pumpkin spice, good for a latte, great for a beer.
I think you could almost call this the Harpoon Dunkin' Chai beer and probably get away with that as well.
You can call it a lot of things, Josh, and as long as they're not too mean, no one will sue us for it.
Well, one thing you pointed out to me that I did not realize is there is an entire series of Harpoon Dunkin' collaboration beers besides the pumpkin that you actually saw in the grocery store. Is that right, Dan?
That is true. So stay tuned. I will bring you something even more absurd than this Dunkin' pumpkin beer.
All right. And if you find it out in your neck of the woods and you give it a try, let us know what your favorite Harpoon Dunkin' Donuts beer is.
With that, Josh, we want to thank our sponsors, Promega. In 2021, Promega is celebrating the 30th anniversary of bioluminescence as a tool for life science research. From illuminating protein interactions to giving us brighter tools for imaging, luminescent proteins have brought light to many different areas of research. When you're looking to study complex biological interactions, a bioluminescent reporter assay may be the tool you're looking for. Explore resources on bioluminescence and learn how it could be applied to your project by visiting promega.com/hellophd.
Also, Dan, we want to thank our friends at BioBox. Are you spending months learning how to use bioinformatic tools? Leverage the BioBox platform to process, analyze, and explore your genomic data without learning how to code. Accelerate your research and sign up for your 30-day free trial at biobox.io. All right, Dan, let's get on with our topic of the week. All right, Dan, tell me a little bit about this interview that you did for today's show.
Yeah, I spoke with Andrea Hayward, who is a senior associate of Global Community Engagement at Cactus Communications. And Cactus is a foundation that released a mental health survey to scientists around the globe. So obviously, it's a global mental health survey. It's kind of makes sense. But one thing I wanted to read before I get to the interview, they had a little preface to the survey results that they put out in PDF form. And I thought this was really meaningful. They said, "Dear reader, if there's anything that COVID-19 pandemic has taught us, it's that researchers are indispensable to our world." I think, Josh, you and I can agree with that statement, particularly in light of COVID-19. But they go on, "Through their passion and dedication, they shoulder our hope for a better tomorrow. But their work environment is often harsh, unforgiving, hyper-competitive, and rife with failure and rejection. And mental health challenges are fairly common in academia. While we are sure it will be a fascinating and insightful read, we would like it to be just the starting point for an important global conversation on mental health in academia and a movement toward a more positive research culture." And I think that just encapsulates what this report is about, Josh, and about what we're going to hear from Andrea.
Yeah, this is probably one of the most important topics in science training right now. And so I am eager to learn more about this survey and the results and what they tell us about science training today.
Here's the interview. Today I am joined by Andrea Hayward. She's a senior associate of Global Community Engagement for Cactus Communications. Welcome, Andrea.
Hi. Thank you, Daniel, for having me today. It's great to be here. So you already mentioned that I work for Cactus Communications. So that is a global technology company that is devoted to accelerating scientific advancement. We started out as an organization that was more interested, or rather, that was all we were doing at the time. But we wanted to help researchers overcome the language barrier when it came to academic publication. And so since then, we've branched out into several other endeavors. So we have training and development for researchers now. We have an ecosystem of tools and products that we've recently released called the Researcher Ecosystem, which again is helped to support researchers in various parts of their academic journeys. And we also do something with research communication. And as you already know, the topic of the hour is we have been doing things related to researcher well-being and mental health as well. So I have been with Cactus for the past 5 years or so, and I've done a whole lot of things since I got here. But what I'm doing now is something that is the most special to me, is the thing that I connect with most. So I'm part of the community engagement team at Cactus. So it really allows me to connect with researchers on a more personal level. And for the past 2 years or so, I have been running the Cactus Mental Health Initiative, which includes a whole lot of activities, including the Cactus Mental Health Survey that we'll be talking about soon.
Yeah, that's great by way of introduction for understanding what Cactus does. And as you mentioned, what we want to talk about today is this mental health survey that you conducted among scientists around the globe. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. We had a total of 13,000 researchers from across the globe participate. And it was a pretty long survey. So I always make it a point to appreciate them when I do talks like these, because they gave us their time and their experiences. So yeah, it was a pretty global survey.
Yeah, and let's start with what made you want to study mental health in scientists. You talk about there being some systemic issues in both academic and commercial research. So can you talk about what some of those things that you saw were that made you want to do the survey?
Sure. So when we decided to do this, it was more us trying to help researchers in aspects that weren't related to academic publication like we were doing. So we have been talking to a lot of researchers for 20 years now. So we definitely knew that we were helping them in one aspect of their lives. But as we started speaking to them more, getting to know them better, we realized that we're not even scratching the surface. There's a lot more that's going on. There's a lot more that we can do. And there are several factors in an academic's life that aren't really in their control and part of the system, as you say. So there was actually a precursor to the survey. It was a project I ran called Researchers and Their Stories. What I wanted to do through this was just get researchers to talk about themselves as people first and get to know the people behind the science. So we ended up collecting about 450 stories, I think close to 500 stories.
Wow.
Unique stories. And they were great. We got to know, so there were topics like a day in the life of a PhD student, or what I did after I wrote my thesis, or what it felt like in my first week of graduate school. So it was quite varied and it was great. But with the positive stories came a lot of topics that were problematic, that were concerning. So there were topics like depression, imposter feelings. So that came as a shock to us. It shouldn't have, because it was already, there's so much about it, but it made us wonder how many more researchers were out there that were probably struggling and who probably didn't have necessarily a platform on which they could share what they were going through. And so that was the feedback we got from the Researchers and Their Stories project, that thank you for asking me. No one's ever asked me before. And so we figured that if you could create a sort of safer space where they don't necessarily have to put in their names and they can tell us, and we can compile some data and get some actual data together, that would be great.
Yeah, and you note in the study that it's really common to experience stress and burnout, mental and physical illness. I think you mentioned that the risk is higher in PhD students, that half experience psychological distress and a third are at risk for a psychiatric disorder. And that really, again, it's one of these shocking but not surprising statistics.
Right. So I think some of these very specific statistics related to mental illness came from prior studies and not from this particular one.
Yeah, I think it was in your introduction or in one of the executive overviews. It was just laying out the importance of studying this further.
Yeah, absolutely. But now that you mention it, I feel like, so one thing to note here is that PhD students made up they were the largest group from our global sample. I think they accounted for about 30% of everyone who took the survey. And as we talk, we'll see that they have stood out as a group that's gotten the shorter end of the stick, for lack of a better phrase. And we were talking about stress. So to start off with one of the findings that really bothered me, we saw that 1/3 of the entire sample said that they felt overwhelmed by their work situation fairly or very often. And when you're reading it, it sounds, okay, it's not that bad. It's 38%, it's 37%. But if you think of just that one person who is experiencing this kind of feeling, who's feeling so overwhelmed by their work situation that they cannot work, then it really makes you wonder. And it's so many people. And we found that PhD students were most likely than any other group to express this sentiment.
Yeah, it's so helpful too. I think to give people context on the type of survey that it is. The question was, in the last month, how often have you felt overwhelmed by your situation at work? And then people could answer never, almost never, sometimes fairly often, or very often. And as you said, 38% said that they had felt overwhelmed fairly or very often in the previous month. So this is not talking about what the effect of that type of stress, that feeling of overwhelmed nature, is over the course of 4 or 5 years, or 10 years, or a decade, as a career.
Yeah.
And what I really enjoyed about this study is we talked about how you asked questions in 169 countries. So I think 11% of the respondents were in North America, 20% Europe, 50% Asia, 39% faculty, and I can't remember what the number of PhD students was. But you were able to differentiate between these places and these people in their roles. So respondents working in Asia were less likely than those from other regions to state that they felt overwhelmed frequently, either fairly or very often. And so these differences start to make you ask deeper questions like, well, is scientific research better in Asia, or are people in Asia less likely to say that they feel overwhelmed? And do you have a sense of some of those things?
That's actually a great question. It's something so the survey's been out for a while, the results have been out, and I still find myself questioning some of this. So we didn't really do follow-up questions to some of these, and there was a long answer kind of question towards the end. But personally, I feel like, given that I am from Asia, I feel like the taboo around just admitting that you are stressed or you're overwhelmed or you can't handle the work is a lot here. I'm sure it's pretty much the same everywhere else. But I feel like just culturally, we feel like that there's that fear of being perceived negatively if you even admit to not being able to manage. And you have no option but to cope. So it might just be the case that they were feeling stressed or they were feeling overwhelmed and they just didn't want to admit it to the extent. And the taboo might be so deep that even in an anonymous survey, they couldn't get themselves to maybe admit it.
So we don't necessarily think everybody who's feeling stressed at work should move to Asia where it's calm and everybody's underworked and takes a lot of leisure time. It's not the finding.
No, I don't think that's how we should read the results. I feel like it's probably just more acceptance maybe in the UK, in Europe, in the US for just people admitting that they're stressed or they can't manage on any given day.
Yeah, I mean, case in point, if you want to complain about graduate school, you can get a podcast and complain about graduate school all you want for the next 10 years. So I am proof that in the United States, we are willing to say that was hard. You one of the questions you asked was about the working hours. And famously in graduate school, nights and weekends and holidays, even though you may not need to be there, you feel like you should be there, and so you go. Can you talk about what you found in your survey about working hours for researchers?
Sure. So we found, again, that I think similar to the people who said they were feeling overwhelmed, we found about 31% who reported working more than 50 hours a week. And then there was 13% who reported working more than 60 hours per week. So again, I think whenever I talk about the survey, I feel the need to reiterate that it might seem small. It's 13%, but it's 13% of 13,000 researchers across the globe. So I don't see why anyone should have to be working these many hours. And even I feel like questioning if they are, then is it like a long day, or are they pulling, I don't know, all-nighters? Are they working weekends? So I feel like these are some of the questions that they should raise.
Yeah, and again, with the being able to divide out the types of jobs, you noted that 32% work upwards of 50 hours a week in academic settings, but in government, industry, and the not-for-profit sectors, it's only 25%. And so somebody looking for maybe a little more work-life balance may want to think again about an academic career as opposed to one in industry or a nonprofit.
Yeah, that's probably right. I feel like this particular variation is probably because a government job or an industry job might have that uh, might have some aspect of human resource management, and because of that, there might be people who are actually looking out for your well-being, or you have set hours and set you have clearly defined work goals, you could say, or your role has specific objectives and specific responsibilities. Whereas if you're in academia, then there's just a whole lot of things you have to do, and sometimes the responsibilities clash. Sometimes you have so many things to do that you might feel like you're doing three roles. So I feel like that whole human resource factor is actually missing in academia, and there's no one really thinking about their well-being in that sense.
Yeah, there's no programmatic department to make sure that
Yeah,
people are following uh, good work practices in that way. And I think
yeah,
what we're going to try to do is in a follow-up episode, we're going to talk about some of the recommendations that came from the study that you did. I think it's going to be really valuable to people, not just to say, hey, there's a problem here, but there are some
yeah.
concrete steps we can take. And so you and I are going to follow up on that. Can you talk a little bit about the questions and the responses you got on discrimination and harassment? I noticed
Sure.
that you said 64% of the respondents said they felt welcome and included in their organization, but
Mhm.
37% had experienced or were experiencing discrimination, harassment, or bullying. And that
Yeah.
tended to be in mixed race researchers, researchers identifying as homosexual, female
Yeah.
researchers. So, can you talk about what is what is happening where we have this large group of people who say, "Hey, this is working for me. I feel welcome," but a group of people that are being actively discriminated against or perceive that in their daily work?
Yeah. Yeah. Sure. So, and I'm drawing from a new project that I'm currently working on, where we're going to do more to talk about bullying and harassment in academia. But I feel like when it comes to discrimination, bullying, and harassment, there's a lot of things that you would consider as blatant bullying or blatant harassment, like physical abuse or verbal abuse. But there's also a lot of tiny things that don't necessarily get pegged as bullying, but it is. And I feel like a lot of people might be going through this and they might not even necessarily know. So if I can give you an example, so if say if it's a person, if it's a person from a different country and they're working in a different country than they're originally from, it could be a social isolation kind of situation where they are deliberately excluded from group meetings or social gatherings. And they might not necessarily look at it as bullying. They might think, oh, maybe I'm different, so maybe I'm not cut out for the group or I'm not cut out for the team. But that's not the case. So I feel like there's a lot of these, I don't know what word to use for them, but just behaviors and actions and communication styles, even passive aggressive communication, for example, that could be bullying and harassment, but a lot of people might not necessarily look at it that way. I feel like a lot of people who said that they felt welcome and included, even though we had about 40% of the people say that they felt bullied and harassed, I feel like there is this normalization of certain behaviors in academia, wherein people feel like just because I went through this and I had to struggle through it, you have to as well. And that's just how it is. And
It's a
you
culture
better
of
toughen up.
hazing in
Yeah,
some
yeah,
places, and I've seen researchers, faculty members who believe in that system, and I've seen some that don't. And so it really
yeah,
depends on what lab you end up in and what department you end up
yeah.
in, whether you'll experience that. But I've certainly seen it.
Absolutely. So maybe the people who didn't say that they were experiencing it, maybe they're coming from a place of, oh, it could be worse. I'm
Right.
so it's all in fun. They're just maybe they're joking. They don't mean it. It could be way worse. So I feel like maybe that's why we have this kind of variation here in both findings.
Yeah. And the next set of questions that you asked kind of alarmed me a little bit because you asked whether people would get support, whether they would ask for help if they needed it. And I think of this particularly in light of these discrimination questions that we were just talking about.
Yeah.
And 49%, almost half, said they would not discuss work-based feelings of severe stress or anxiety with the relevant people or authorities in their workplace. Can you...
Right.
Half of people won't go ask for help. Can you talk about why that is and what are some of the barriers?
Sure. Just looking at some of the later questions in the survey, wherein we asked them, if not, then why? I feel it would be interesting to draw on some of those reasons here. So I feel like most people felt that they wouldn't be understood or that they would be perceived negatively. So we had a couple of people say, so some of the reasons rather for why people wouldn't seek help was that they would be perceived as weak, or people would not understand them, or even if people would, then they wouldn't necessarily be able to provide the kind of support they need. And I think one of the most problematic ones here is most of them thought that feeling stressed, overwhelmed, and anxious is just a regular part of academic life. It's just a routine rite of passage. And I think that one is the one that worried me the most as well. So maybe there's this feeling that they have to go through it, and if you're not going through it, then maybe you're not doing it right.
Yeah, we begin to normalize the behavior. We normalize the discrimination. Yeah. We normalize the feeling of being overwhelmed. And then why should you try to change it? Because that's just how it is, and that is a dangerous road to be on.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like a lot of people were also worried that they wouldn't be taken seriously. And I think that's something that decision makers in academia really should take as, I don't know, like a warning bell, because if someone's struggling and they can't talk to you about it because they feel that you won't take something as serious as depression seriously, then we really have cause to really reevaluate everything, I feel.
That's right. And it's not, what's interesting about the survey is it's not all bad news. One of the questions you asked talked about, do you feel inspired, or do you go to work and want to be there? And overwhelmingly, people are getting fulfillment out of this idea of doing scientific research. So talk about that a minute, about working in this inspiring environment.
Yeah, so that is why that's why we wanted to call it joy and stress triggers, because we wanted to know what is causing them stress, of course, but what is also working for researchers in research culture or about their work that's bringing
people
them joy.
Keep going to do it. There must be something desirable about it, right?
Right. So like you said, nearly half of the survey respondents, they said that the academic environment they worked in inspired them to work to their goals. But in the open comments, we found that a lot of this, it reflected more the support of their peers and colleagues rather than support that they were necessarily receiving from the institution or the university at large. So maybe these results are just reflecting that one great colleague and just the work. I feel like a lot of them also said that they agreed that their work kept them excited about what they were doing, and they liked the intellectual challenges that it presented. So I feel like the work necessarily that people are doing, because a lot of people choose their own research areas. So I don't think the work necessarily is the problem here. I feel like the environment in which the work is being done, or rather certain processes and systems that they have to go through in order to do the work, I think that's the thing that's causing the problem.
Yeah, and it's interesting, again, the split between you had more senior respondents, the faculty member level or postdocs, were more likely to be inspired by their environment compared to PhD students or those who worked in research for less than 10 years. And why do you think that difference exists? Did we lose those people that didn't find it inspiring, and so only the ones who were inspired moved on? Or do you think it's really a difference in the nature of graduate training?
I don't think there's a way to say if we lost the people who didn't find it inspiring. Maybe for the folks who are in more senior positions, maybe they've already been through it. And so they're comparing where they are now or how less difficult. I'm not going to use the word easy because it's not easy at any stage,
Right.
but how relatively less difficult it is for them right now, or maybe they find it inspiring because they now have job security, which they didn't have before. And maybe they're not constantly worrying about what comes next. Whereas for a PhD student or someone in graduate school, that's got to be a question that bothers them, I think, almost every day. So maybe the variation in terms of role or designation, I think that probably stems from here.
So let's move to the topic of job prospects and about what people see on the horizon, where they're looking as they move through their training. Because you asked several questions about what are your options? What is your outlook for your career?
Right. So we found here that although a lot of people said, I think about 60%, almost 2/3 of people probably said that they have plenty of opportunities to learn and grow. It was kind of ironic that a similar proportion of people also said that they didn't know where they could probably find these opportunities, or they didn't know what kind of opportunities were available to them. And I feel that just speaks to a lack of, or rather a gap in training, wherein you're not preparing graduate students or maybe people who've just started out in their careers. You're not telling them the kind of options that they have, and there's no conversation around this. Even on Twitter, I see a lot of graduate students posting questions about, is an industry job really an option for me? And there's a couple of people who respond, but that shouldn't be the case, right? They shouldn't have to go onto a social media website to get this kind of information. These kind of details, I feel, should actually be provided to them without them even asking for it.
Yeah, speaking of normalizing behaviors and activities, it should be normal for researchers to work in industry after they graduate. I think that makes sense.
So we also found about 2/3 of our global samples said that they wouldn't mind looking outside of academia. And so that's another thing. I think if we want to retain this kind of high quality talent, then that's something that just academia in general should be worried about. If so many people are okay. Not to say that an industry role would be bad or it's bad for someone to move, but if you want to keep your people, I feel like you should be doing a better job at making their stay pleasant.
That is such an interesting point, because on our podcast, we have talked for a long time about, again, normalizing this movement between academia and industry, or a nonprofit sector, or a government job, and making people not feel bad about that transition.
Right.
But you're turning that around and saying, hey, academia, do you want to lose your best people? Do you want people graduating but not coming back to the institution to help, create the next generation of scientists? It's a kind of a brain drain type of situation if academia becomes too toxic.
I feel like I'm not coming from you need to stay to give back. I'm coming from a position where I feel like it shouldn't be that bad in academia that people are forced to choose industry just for things like job security or work-life balance. They should be presented to them as two equally cool things that they might choose to do. And I feel like people shouldn't have to move to industry, not that it's bad, but they shouldn't be forced to make that choice just for things like a reasonable salary or, like I said, work-life balance or better policies. I feel like I'm coming from that place.
Yeah, that's great. And it's a good distinction.
About 60%, they agreed that they felt unsure about their job prospects and the chances of having a stable career. But I feel like PhD students and postdoctoral researchers, they were most likely to agree with this about feeling unsure about their job prospects. So 70% of PhD students, they agreed with this statement, and 73% of postdoctoral researchers agreed with this statement.
One really common experience for scientists and people at all levels, we are learning, I think, is this notion of imposter syndrome. And you had a question that resulted in 35% of the respondents saying that they doubt their work achievement and felt like they do not belong in academia. And you said 28% were unhappy about academia as a career choice. And this was, again, it was split between senior and early career researchers. So is it just that common that we all feel like we don't belong in this system? And is it possible for everybody to not belong in academia?
I feel like we all have imposter feelings to some extent, and I don't think it's a thing of people not belonging at all. I feel like it's more about people not getting consistent recognition and validation that they deserve. Or if you're in graduate school, then you think you've made it after you've defended your dissertation. You've done so many things along the way. You've picked up so many new skills. But there's no one telling you, "Oh my God, you did a great job. Good job. This was amazing." There's so many people who aren't doing this, and you're actually breaking ground and you're discovering new things on a daily basis. I feel like the end goal is magnified to the extent that the little steps and the little things along the way aren't necessarily given importance. And so I think it's only natural for people to feel like they aren't doing it right, or they don't belong, or someone else is doing it better than them. I feel imposter feelings probably stem from this competitive environment that most academic settings have. And I feel like it also stems from there not being enough conversation about failure and failure experiences. Like social media, everyone's just putting their best foot forward. They're telling you about that one paper that got published. They're not telling you about the 7 journals that rejected the same paper. It's not even about putting your failures on blast. I feel like speaking about failures really humanizes the experience, and it reminds you that there's a person behind the paper that you're evaluating or the experience that you're assessing. And so I feel like we need more of this if we want to not completely do away with imposter feelings, but at least make people feel like they belong.
Yeah, that's great. And a constant reminder, I feel like we just have to keep saying, you are not the only person who feels that way. And no matter how confident the people around you look, they're having some of the same emotions, the same experiences. And so every chance I get, I try to remind people, I felt that way. My co-host Josh felt that way. Everybody feels that way. And it could be at any time in your career, not just as a PhD student. We've talked to faculty members who say, I've been here 5 years and I still don't feel like I fit. Yeah. I've got tenure and I still don't feel like I belong. So this is just a part of life, and talking about it is the best way forward. Andrea, we have covered a lot of ground, but really only scratched the surface on both the mental health survey and the recommendations. So how can people find these documents and learn more about the work of Cactus?
We have both survey reports. They're very extensive. One of them, I think, is 60 pages. We have them both available on a website. It is cactusglobal.com/mental health survey. And I think we can maybe put it in the description. Daniel, does that?
Sure. Yeah, we'll put a link in the show notes. That'd be great.
Great. So you can access both those there. They're freely downloadable. And you can follow us on Twitter at CactusMHS. That's our Twitter handle. We're constantly talking about this. We wanted the survey to not be just a one-time thing. And I'm happy to say that there's several more initiatives and activities that have come out from this. So we have an academic mental health webinar series. We're currently working on something to do with bullying and harassment. And lots more. So I'm hoping that we can use this database that we've generated and actually implement some of these suggestions and changes that have come through in a bigger way.
And it'd be so interesting to ask these questions over time to see how they shift. I mean, you conducted the survey during a global pandemic. Did that make things worse or better? Did people have more work-life balance because they were home? It's so fascinating, and I hope that we can talk to you again as you continue to work on this subject.
Absolutely. I'd love that.
Wow, Dan, thanks for doing that interview. That was extremely insightful.
Yeah, I got a lot out of it just talking through some of the topics. They're not necessarily things that we haven't discussed before, although I think it's nice to put data onto it and really to get that global perspective. You and I went through a program in a single university in the United States, but this is not confined to our experience. Obviously, this is something that's happening around the world.
Absolutely. And, so much of this, Dan, echoes or harkens back to or just affirms even why we do this show and why we started doing this show 6 years ago was these feelings that we had coming through training, these challenges that we faced, not necessarily even with always the science itself, but everything else that went along with being in academia, going through graduate school. But it was so easy to feel isolated and alone that you were broken in some way because you were feeling this way. And I think we've come a long way since the time that in our understanding of these challenges that face trainees and these systems that are in place that perpetuate these challenges since the time we were in graduate school, but even since the time we started podcasting 5 or 6 years ago, and doing these comprehensive surveys like Cactus is doing that Andrea talked about. This is really the data that is needed to, I would think, rally institutions, those in charge, to see the problem, acknowledge the problem, and actually put things in place to remedy the problem.
And do you see that change coming from above or from the grassroots? Like, I can imagine in the United States, the NIH saying, look, we see this as an issue. Therefore, if you want funding, you have to follow these 15 guidelines. Or do you see it as students saying, look, this isn't okay. We need to make a change in our department?
I think it has to be both. I think it can be both. I think it has to come at some point. There has to be acknowledgement from the decision-making bodies, which certainly includes funders, like you mentioned, but I think also includes leadership at academic institutions to recognize that these issues are in play. And to some degree, I think what's challenging is we can acknowledge, and I think many academic leaders have acknowledged, that there is a mental health crisis among science trainees. I think the challenge, though, is where do you go beyond that? So we acknowledge that these challenges are at play with our trainees, but what do we do about it? What's behind it? What's causing it, right? Because if you don't have a clear vision of what's causing it, then what can happen, and I think this might be where we are right now at a lot of institutions, putting in place mechanisms to treat the symptoms, which is not necessarily a bad thing. So I know at my own previous institution and other institutions like it, this increased focus on student mental health has led to things like increased student wellness and mental health services for graduate students specifically, increased mental health and wellness activities. Like, those are great, but what they really do is they help graduate students deal with and manage mental health challenges they're having during their training without necessarily targeting or understanding the underlying mechanisms leading to those challenges. And I think that's really the future. And surveys like this, I think, are really important to help to tease that out a little bit.
Yeah, and I will say we're going to talk to Andrea in the next episode about some of the solutions that that came out of the survey where they asked open-ended questions. What would you do about this to the people who responded? But Josh, I think you're so right. If mental health were a physical manifestation, if razor blades were laying around the lab and people kept getting cut on them, we wouldn't say, well, we're opening a Band-Aid station, right? We would we put a Sharps container in to solve the problem so that we don't need a Band-Aid station. And I think what you're getting at is we're dealing with the effects of some of these problems, but we're not dealing with the sources of it. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more next week.
Yeah, I do want to say, you sent me the audio of this interview, and I was listening in my car as I was driving a couple days ago. And when she got to this one part, I started like pumping my fist like in the air. I'm sure I was like at the stoplight,
head banging.
Like, yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, one of the things that Andrew said really was channeling my main mantra or hypothesis or philosophy or whatever you want to call it, my belief system of science training and the issues with science training when we were in graduate school and today. And one of the things, and what she said, I'm paraphrasing here, is that it's not the science that people don't like, but it's the environment in which they are doing science. And I think the data speaks very clearly from this survey,
Exactly.
this worldwide survey that Cactus did. And so I felt very affirmed because we've said it so many times, Dan, that we think science is so important, and even if we think about our own experiences, I know speaking for myself, and I think you had a similar experience. I can remember when I first was exposed to doing science in the lab. For me, I was a junior in undergrad, and I thought, well, this is amazing. Like, this is so cool. And at that point, my experience with science was so pure. It was just about the doing science part. I wasn't aware of or mixed up in all the other academic baggage. It was just me and the experiments and that part of doing science.
And great people. You made great friends. You worked hard. You stayed late, but it was exciting and exhilarating. Your mentor was a mentor, encouraging you, training you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a great experience. I remember you talking about it.
And I thought, like, science is great. This is amazing. This is what I want to do for my whole life. I feel like I have clarity finally for what I want to do. But then over time, that enthusiasm waned as I started. That passion for science started also coming up against some of the structures of graduate school, the open-endedness of deadlines and timelines, the lack of sort of recognition or boundaries with regard to work-life balance, the uncertainty of career transitions. All these other pieces really started to overshadow or overwhelm even that initial just pure love of science and doing experiments and talking to people around me about science. And I don't think my story is unique there. I would say many trainees, at some point, many trainees probably are less enthusiastic about science by the end of their training than they were at the beginning. And I think that bore out in the data from the survey as well.
Yeah, the roadblock that each person hits might be a little bit different. It could be an unresponsive PI or maniac PI. It could be difficult to get funding. It could be a toxic work relationship. It could be all sorts of different things. But I think you're right. The joy of doing science can be dulled or changed by some of these experiences. I think it comes out in the survey, Josh, exactly what you said, that a lot of people said, I'm very fulfilled by this work. I'm motivated. I'm inspired. So there's a when they stop and think about the actual work that they're doing, they feel great about it and they want to do it. But then they feel overworked and they feel like they're being discriminated against or harassed. And those are all external to what you're talking about, which is doing science can be joyful.
Absolutely. Dan, one thing I wanted to mention that came up in the interview was a mention that graduate students don't often have the same sort of protections that other employees at the institution have.
Time and time again, graduate students seem to have it worse in terms of these mental health questions.
Yeah, that can be true. And I think, and this is certainly true of postdocs. Actually, sometimes postdocs have it the worst of anyone because they're not classified as a student or a permanent employee of the institution. But graduate students do exist in this strange middle space at the university, at least, where they are classified as students, but fundamentally their day-to-day and the way they are experiencing the university and contributing at the university is very different than like an undergraduate student. They're not really taking classes. They really are functioning more like an employee. They have supervisory relationships. They're coming in, they're doing work all the time. But because they don't have these same employee protections or employee considerations, that sets up a system where labor abuses or less than ideal work environments can occur. I do want to say, though, I think it's really important for students to be aware, and I was not necessarily aware of this as a student, but most universities, most institutions these days do have policies in place that protect everyone at the institution, including students, and sometimes especially students. I would advise and recommend to all students that you just spend a little bit of time poking around your institution's website. You could probably even do a Google search for University of so-and-so policy on harassment or discrimination or whatever, because I imagine that your university, most universities, at least in the United States and probably elsewhere too, have written public policies on how people at the institution, no matter what their level, should be treated, and that there probably also are procedures in place when those policies are not met. And it can be really handy to know that those exist because they can give you a little bit of framework towards the front of your mind when you see an infringement of those policies occur. One, you can identify it as such, and two, you might know you would have a better idea of the appropriate channels to address it.
I like that, and I think that might help to address one of my primary concerns in this survey, which is that seeking support question, where 49% of respondents said they would not discuss work-related feelings of severe stress or anxiety with relevant people in their workplace. And the barriers were a sense that nobody could help them, that it might reflect poorly on them, fear of not being taken seriously. I think there's this power differential where I'm a graduate student. I am suffering mentally in my work. I am working too many hours, or I don't feel supported, or I'm sacrificing parts of my mental health to do this job. But then who do I talk to? I'm not going to go to my PI because I don't want to look bad, or maybe they won't help me. I can't really go to the director of graduate studies because what are they going to do? Talk to my PI, and then it becomes a problem in a different way. And so I was wondering if you have seen cases where students were able to receive accommodations or help, or to get a change in their workload or whatever was stressing them by going and talking to somebody. Have you ever seen that happen?
It can happen. Yes, it can happen on a case-by-case basis, but I think this is...
And who do they have to talk to?
Well, I think this is a great example, Dan, of one of these structural barriers, or at least structural challenges to students getting the accommodations or getting the support that they need, because often, the person they would need to go to, or at least at some point would need to be made aware for this to happen, is the advisor, is the thesis advisor. And personally speaking, I think this is one of the big challenges to some of these structural environmental problems is, and we've talked about this on the show before, so much rests on that relationship between the student and the advisor for the student to proceed through the program, for them to eventually transition successfully out of the program, even sometimes on their immediate job prospects afterwards with like a letter of recommendation. And so as a graduate student, those incentive structures, you so need that relationship with the advisor to be positive, just so you can move on with your life and your career, that with that power differential and the importance of that relationship, that professional relationship, sometimes like it has to get really bad for you to want to rock the boat at all, for fear of disrupting that relationship.
And that's the thing that no policy can change, Josh. If, let's say I have a poor work environment and my PI expects everybody to be working 80 hours a week or whatever it is, and I go in and I say, look, I can't do this. It is impacting my mental health and my physical health to be in the lab this much. We might have a policy. We may establish a policy in the department that you don't work 80 hours a week, but I can't change the letter of recommendation that my PI writes that says I was never there and I was lazy or whatever. I'm imagining a worst case scenario, but there's no policy that can help me transition in my career based on that relationship with the PI. I just can't imagine how that gets solved.
Well, I think what can happen, and actually, Dan, I would say creating policies around what is appropriate treatment and appropriate conditions for graduate students to work under is an important and necessary first step, because I think in many cases we haven't identified to that specific level, well, what isn't appropriate, what is out of bounds for an advisor to expect of a graduate student. I can say that some institutions that I know of have started drafting these policies for what is appropriate expectations and treatment of graduate students. And I think that is a necessary first step. And that's something I would encourage all institutions that train graduate students to do. You involve, this is not one person putting this together, but I've seen this happen, Dan, when you bring faculty together, you bring students together, you bring administrators together, they can collectively come up with reasonable, agreed upon expectations where the work can get done, but graduate students can be treated fairly and appropriately. Because until you have those policies written down, then the next step, and this is where I don't think we are yet in academia, the next step is there have to be some teeth, right? So what if you fail to follow those policies? Then what happens? And I think that is where academia has really fallen short. Is there are very few examples that I know of where an advisor has mistreated a trainee, and then there have actually been consequences for that.
Yep, and we're going to get into that more in the next episode because that is something that I have experienced and seen in my life, and I would love to explore that more. If you can find some of those policies for us next week, Josh, I think it'd be fun to unpack some of those because the solutions to this are as important as identifying the problem.
Absolutely. Well, Dan, thank you for reaching out. I'm looking forward to part 2 of this episode. But again, I think it's so important that this work is being done because until we really identify the problem, can we then put in place specific solutions? The one thing, Dan, this is a random aside, but this was a global survey of many scientists in many countries, correct?
True.
I would love to know how our grad student friends in Australia are doing, because as we have documented on the show before, Australia has a very unique time to degree that is short, and that is one of my other hypotheses that the open-ended nature of PhD training contributes to mental health challenges. So I'd love to know how our friends in the land down under are faring in this survey.
Maybe we can reach out to Andrea and find out. They did have 2% of the respondents came from Australasia, Oceania. There were 2 people in Antarctica that responded to the survey, so that was something too.
I guess we can't disaggregate their responses without breaking anonymity, given the number of grad students.
The 2 people in Antarctica, I think you're correct. Maybe next time, Josh.
Yeah, Dan. Well, this was fantastic. Thanks again, and certainly encourage everyone to tune in and hear the next part of this interview. I also want to say, if you know of your institution, if you know or have heard that your institution has drafted or created some policies specific for the proper treatment or expectations of graduate students specifically, let us know. We would love to hear about what's happening in your specific environment.
That'd be great to share in the next episode as well. So if you have question or topic ideas, we would love to hear them. You can email us, podcast@hellophd.com. Send us a tweet @hellophd. If you like the show, you can leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. We love the feedback, and it helps new listeners find the show. If you'd like to support us, you can become a patron. Simply go to our website, hellophd.com, and click the Become a Patron button, or visit patreon.com/hellophd. We'd appreciate the Dunkin' Donuts beer money. Thanks to the ongoing support from our patrons.
Dan, I'm going to try an experiment where I'm going to just purchase a generic amber beer and a pumpkin donut, and I'm going to just mash it up in there, and then we're going to drink it and see which one we like better.
You're going to drink it, Josh. I'm not going to drink it. You enjoy that, and we'll see you next time.
All right, Dan. See you next time.